Can you hear me now?
Yes, much clear.
So I just logged out and logged in again. So in a company, as I said, having a code of ethics or a code of business conduct alone is not enough. You have to create awareness about the code of ethics. You need to have refresher sessions. You need to have a proper induction program for new staff where they get to familiarize themselves with the contents, the ethics policy of the company. And also it is important for staff to know what a fraud is, what are the red flags in fraud, if they detect any suspicious activities or red flags, they need to be vigilant and bring it to notice of the relevant authority. They need to call the hotline. The whistleblowing policy needs to be communicated properly to staff, and also they need to be aware of their responsibilities when it comes to if you take the board of directors, the CEO, the management, the internal audit department, heads of division, all of them have a responsibility when it comes to fraud. So if you have not documented it, or if you have not made the employees, directors, management accountable and responsible, and if they are not made aware of their responsibilities in relation to fraud, in relation to fraud prevention and fraud detection, it is very likely that frauds will be prevalent in such an environment. So you have to create an anti-fraud culture in the organization where everyone is very vigilant about the possibility of fraud taking place in the organization, and there is no complacency. Why frauds happen in companies is because sometimes people are complacent. They think in their company frauds can't happen. Everyone is good and can be trusted, and so forth. So then frauds happen and they get surprised. So fraud awareness has to be created. A fraud risk assessment has to be done. This is also an important component in the fraud risk program. An assessment has to be done to identify the frauds that could take place in the company, identification, then these frauds which are identified, the frauds that could occur in the organization, all the fraud scenarios should be identified, and then of course after identification you have to evaluate it. And evaluation generally means you look at the likelihood of the fraud occurring in your organization and the impact to the organization if it materializes. So, and then a fraud risk assessment would also entail putting in place internal controls to prevent those frauds from happening. And then it will also help to identify who is responsible for implementing those risks and managing or preventing those frauds from taking place through a fraud risk register. So you have to adopt that sort of an approach, and then ongoing reviews are important. That is, of course, internal audit plays an important role there. Also, the heads of the departments play an important role in carrying out reviews to see whether the internal controls which have been put in place by the organization are properly working as intended. So you need to review the internal control more than the design, the effectiveness, the operating effectiveness through ongoing reviews, right? Prevention and detection is very important, and that is done through controls. Controls in the form of policies and procedures. So some controls help to prevent fraud. Some controls help to detect fraud. If you do a cash count is a fraud, is a detective internal control. So if there's a shortage or a fraud, you might detect it. But if you look at a control like carrying out background checks, providing training to your staff according to the SOP, how to carry out transactions, provide training to staff on the code of ethics, have segregation of duties, review and authorization of documents, that sort of thing. Those are all preventive controls, which will enable the organization to prevent the fraud in the first place. And then investigation is also an important part in any fraud management program, because if fraud is detected by some chance, then it is important for the organization to conduct a fraud investigation, because some organizations still do not think that an investigation is required. They don't go to that extent, doing a full investigation, finding out who is responsible and filing a case. They don't do that. And when if there is a what you call an allegation of fraud against someone, if there is something like that allegation, you have to carry out your inquiries, and if the inquiry leads to the fact that something has gone wrong here, then a full-blown investigation must be done. And if you don't do an investigation, people will take it very lightly. They will feel that they can get away with a fraud because the organization is not serious about carrying out investigation, or the organization is not serious about deploying resources and spending some cash, some money on getting an investigation done. So all these aspects are very important. All 6 aspects are very important elements in the fraud risk program. Then talking about internal control frameworks, you all know, we learn about it in a different module, that our main framework as internal auditors is the COSO framework. That is the foundation framework, right? We have to be all aware of this framework. And if you look at the COSO framework, right, the COSO framework consists of, I think, about 5 elements, right? And all these elements need to be looked at when you are reviewing a process. You need to think about this and all the elements in the COSO framework. So if you look at the COSO framework, right, I will just try to, we all know about this. I'm just refreshing what you already know. If you look at the COSO framework, you can see it on the screen. This COSO framework has 5 elements: the control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring activities. Now, this control environment, when whatever department that you audit, you must use this framework. Does that department have a proper control environment? Does the organization have a proper control environment? Has that department carried out a proper risk assessment to identify the possibility of the risks of fraud? Are there proper internal control activities in place, preventive or detective? Have all the importance of controls, all that properly communicated, and responsibilities, accountabilities set via the information and communication element. You have to think about that, because there's no point implementing internal controls if they have not been properly communicated to staff. They need to know what the internal control is and why they are performing it, the purpose of the control. Then only they know the gravity of what they are doing. And then monitoring in the form of internal audits or whatever. So when you are looking at fraud also, you have to think about these elements. Now the fraud risk assessment will come in the second stage, risk assessment. In the control stage, information and communication will have the codes of ethics, codes of business conduct, internal control, policies of the organization, the SOP, communication of SOPs and relevant responsibilities, because some people don't know why they prefer that they are carrying out important internal controls. And then monitoring. So if you take the control environment alone out, right? Control, they say, is the primary means of managing fraud and ensuring the components of the fraud management program and are present and functioning. So when you talk about ethics, when you talk about creating awareness about the possibility of fraud, you do a fraud risk assessment. So at the end of all that, you end up with a set of controls to address the frauds, to mitigate, prevent, detect fraud. So you end up with a set of controls. So what is a control? You have to know the definition. It's the principal means of managing fraud. Even if you just do a fraud awareness program, that is not sufficient to manage fraud. So the main thing out of all these elements is preventive and detective internal controls. Those must be there. If that is not there, everything else will just fall apart and frauds will be rampant. Then the control environment, when you look at the control environment, if you go to audit the control environment in an organization, what are you talking about? You're talking about here about the availability of a code of ethics, availability of a code of business conduct, awareness of the ethics code and the whether they are doing awareness sessions. Are they aware? Enforcement of the code of ethics policy, where if there are breaches, you need to enforce it. Enforcement is important, that they will not take all these policies seriously. Enforcement means when there is a breach, you take action and discipline and you go down that route so that it becomes a deterrent to others. It also means that the relevant department should have proper policies and procedures. SOP must be there. Without guidelines, no one is going to, they will just do whatever they want. The availability of a guideline, availability of a fraud policy. What is a fraud policy? Fraud policy is a policy that defines what is a fraud. Red flags of fraud, responsibilities of the board of directors, audit committee, head of internal audit, heads of divisions, management, all employees. What are their responsibilities when it comes to fraud? Because every person in the organization carries out some task and there will be an internal control there. You'll be performing an internal control, whatever the level position of the person. So it's important that there is a fraud policy in place to make people accountable, to show everyone that the organization takes fraud seriously and the organization promotes an anti-fraud culture. So here can you see code of conduct, ethics policy, fraud policy. Important to set the appropriate tone at the top. Then hiring and promotion guidelines, practices. You can't hire people who have carried out frauds in other places. You can't promote people in an organization if there are integrity issues. So are these factors, honesty, integrity, taken into account when you hire people and when you promote people, or don't you take those into account? So all that is important. And then board oversight. What is the responsibility of the board? The board doesn't implement a fraud management program, but it has an oversight responsibility. It has to ask, it has to ensure that there is a fraud policy. They have to approve it at the board level. And they have to ask certain questions from the management. Have you done a risk assessment? Do you know what frauds could take place in the organization, and what sort of action have you taken to mitigate those fraud scenarios? What have you done to check whether those internal controls are operating effectively? So they have to get that sort of information. They have to ask those questions. They don't implement the program, but they implement the policy which says you need to have a program like this, and you need to have controls like this. You need to identify frauds that could take place, and the board needs to have oversight over the fraud management program, right? It doesn't implement it, but it needs to have oversight. I mean, it needs to ask, do we have fraud management program? If we do not have, we should have. Fraud risk assessment involves identifying and prioritizing fraud risk factors and fraud schemes. You identify what sort of frauds could take place in the organization, and then you need to risk rate it based on likelihood and impact. Then put in place proper internal controls for those fraud schemes or fraud scenarios, and ensure that there are controls in place, because there could be gaps. When you identify certain fraud, you will realize that to prevent this fraud or to detect this fraud, the current control design is not sufficient. There are no controls, or the controls are not good enough. So then you have to do something to fill the gaps, right? And you have to put in place fraud prevention and detection controls. Those will be mentioned in the fraud risk register. And you have to test the operating effectiveness of those controls through an internal audit. You have to document and report the fraud risk assessment to the board, at least on an annual basis. So how you do that is in the form of a fraud risk register. So what are control activities? Internal controls are policies. When the board approves policies, in those policies there are important controls. Procedures. Control activities are policies and procedures, right? For example, authority limits, segregation of duties, those are all given in the procedures or in the policies. So control activities are mainly executed by implementing or approving policies and procedures. Fraud-related information communication practices promote the fraud risk management program. This means include fraud awareness training. Yes, so you need to know periodically your fraud risk registers have to be updated so that new frauds that could take place whenever the environment, the systems, processes, or people change in the organization. You need to think about what are the new frauds that could take place. Sometimes the existing frauds could be low risk, but because of changes, now a low risk fraud could now be a medium or high risk. So the priority could change, the risk rate could change. Monitoring evaluates anti-fraud controls. So you need to have whatever the internal controls that you have could be anti-fraud controls, and those are controls. Anti-fraud controls are controls which prevent or detect fraud, anti-fraud, right? And you need to have independent evaluations of the fraud risk management program itself. So when you are doing an internal audit, you don't need to look at purely at the internal controls. You need to look at all these elements. Does the company have an ethics policy? What they have done about fraud awareness training? Have they done a fraud risk assessment? And then only you come to the internal control. So there are other elements in a fraud risk assessment, fraud risk management program that you as an internal auditor need to ensure is properly happening. You can't just have controls and expect controls to work and prevent fraud. You need to have the code of ethics, you need to have the training, so many things. So all elements, and then when frauds take place, investigations should be done. If investigations are not done, then controls will, people will flout. They will not follow or comply with the laid down policies and procedures. So preventing fraud, essential elements in preventing fraud are set in the correct tone. Can you see when you're trying to prevent fraud, it's important. Set the proper tone at the top. The CEO, the board must frequently, when they meet the management, they must say, no, is there a possibility of fraud? How can frauds take place? Have you all evaluated the possibility of frauds taking place in your department? Have you done a fraud risk assessment? What is the situation about the controls? Internal audit has reported on recommended certain internal controls. You must implement them and set the proper tone. Fraud is not tolerated in this organization. If someone says there is an allegation of fraud against someone, you must ensure as a director that it is fully investigated and not taken lightly, because sometimes in organizations things are put under the rug, swept under the rug, right? So you have to, when you emphasize the importance of zero tolerance on fraud and the importance of implementing anti-fraud controls, and when there are non-compliances or breaches, you take decisive action and issue disciplinary warning letters, then that will create a very strong ethical culture or anti-fraud culture. Detecting fraud is also very important. Element in this, employee feedback, having whistleblowing hotlines. Tips, they say, from employees is the most common way. So if I ask you, do you know if there's a fraud in your organization? If I ask you now, to whom should you report it? Do you know the phone number? If you don't know the phone number, do you know where to find it? If you don't know, that means you don't have a proper whistleblowing hotline. Exit interviews, employee surveys once in a way are important. So it's not just whistleblowing hotline. You have to get feedback from the employees via exit interview. Sometimes when people leave, they tell certain things, and that could lead to an investigation, right? Responsibility for controls. Is the internal auditor responsible for controls? No. Internal auditor is not responsible for internal controls. Can you just go through this? I have a bit of a sore throat, so I'll be drinking a little water on and off. So it's very important for you to realize, even at the exam, sometimes we as internal auditors, we feel that we are responsible for establishing and maintaining internal controls. We are not. We are not in the first line of defense. Management is responsible for establishing and maintaining control. That's why you have heads of functions, heads of divisions. It's their responsibility. Heads of divisions usually come under the management, constitutes the management. Internal auditors must assist. So the internal auditor's role is to assist the organization in evaluating the effectiveness and efficiency of controls. So our job is mainly in evaluating. And evaluate, what do we evaluate? Evaluate the effectiveness and efficiency. So EEE, 3 E's, evaluate, effectiveness and efficiency. Effectiveness is it properly preventing and detecting a fraud? Effectiveness. Is it the most appropriate internal control to prevent and detect a certain type of fraud? Or is the internal control, if you audit a certain area, the internal controls that are there in that particular area, are they sufficient to prevent the various fraud scenarios in that process? Are the controls sufficient? So that is one. The other aspect of it is part from effectiveness, efficiency of controls. Efficiency is that control, if you look at the cost benefit of it, does the benefit outweigh the cost? You don't need to have very expensive controls. You have to always, when you're implementing or recommending a control in your reports, you have to do a small cost benefit analysis and see whether the benefit outweighs the cost. Otherwise, there's no point implementing what you call a very cumbersome control, costly control. And you have to make recommendations to improve the controls, given the changes to the fraud environment or fraud landscape at the time you're carrying out the internal audit. So in an assurance engagement, internal auditors must assist the organization. So in assurance engagement, what happens is you, on behalf of the board or the audit committee, will go and look whether the internal controls are good, whether they're operating effectiveness, properly designed, and give assurance to the board that they are okay. You provide an assurance role, right? Assurance means the company is supposed to implement certain controls. Are they properly, effectively working or not? It is assurance. Assurance engagements always result in a conclusion or an opinion. So external auditors, of course, give an opinion. Internal auditors give conclusions. Conclusion is something like saying, you know, you audited the procurement function and we feel that the controls are good. So that's a conclusion. Or you say you feel that these areas controls are not good, but in these areas in procurement controls are good, right? So you give a conclusion. Internal auditors are not responsible for designing and implementing controls. That is obvious, no? We cannot design, we cannot implement, we cannot draft, right? We cannot get involved in all that. Who is responsible for designing and implementing? We can recommend, right? We can review, we can recommend. But whatever control that we recommend in the report, we don't have to worry about it being implemented. That is up to the management. If they want, they can implement. If they don't want, don't implement. It's not our job. It's not our responsibility. Your responsibility is to ensure that controls are either there or not there, or are there and are operating effectively to address or to mitigate the frauds that you have identified. No? In that process, the fraud scenarios that you have identified. So internal auditors acting in a consulting role. Sometimes we are consultants. Can you remember in the definition we said internal audit is a assurance engagement or a consulting engagement. So in a consulting role, if we play when it comes to fraud or controls, we help management identify and assess risk and determine the adequacy of the control environment. So it's more consulting in nature, where we look at improving controls, right? And assessing risks, doing a fraud risk assessment of sort, and then looking at the internal control environment, right? So it depends on the nature, but what happens today is when we do any internal audit, there is an element of assurance and an element of consulting also in it, right? Internal auditors are also unique are in a unique position in the organization to recommend changes to improve the internal control. Yes, so fraud awareness. I said no. In an organization, you have to create fraud awareness. So yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. Like for an example, when in a internal audit engagement, if we are recommending some internal controls and then the subsequently when we are again evaluating the control, if there is a deficiencies, what is our responsibility if the management sometime maybe the management criticize us? This is the recommended by the internal auditor. So what kind of a what is the way that we have to deal with this kind of a situation?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Like we can recommend when we are doing the internal audit engagement, we can recommend these are the internal controls that we have the management can implement. And subsequently when we are doing the audit, we identify the controls that the management has implemented, which were recommended by us, not effectively. Yeah. So at that time, the management can respond for us. These are the controls that the internal auditor has proposed, and what is our responsibility and how we should deal with this kind of situation.
So what you're saying is you do an internal audit and you recommend certain internal controls based on certain gaps.
Yeah.
And then when you come again and you do the audit, you find that some of those internal controls that you have recommended have not been properly implemented.
No, actually they have implemented, right, but the controls are not effectively can detect the frauds and things like that. Yeah.
So it's like this, no? Now that is why you need to have proper knowledge when you are reviewing a process. For the first time when you review it, you must have the knowledge, the experience and the skill to identify the frauds that could occur in that process and to recommend, if possible, the internal controls that should be there in the first instance. Of course, and so that if the systems, if the processes and the technology has not changed, ideally, if you do another internal audit and review the same process, ideally you should not come out with new controls saying now
Yeah.
you need some more controls. Because then they might ask you, you should have told us this earlier, because you
Yeah.
reviewed it earlier. You said these are the only gaps. Now we are doing it again. We have implemented it. Now you are saying there are other gaps. So then the best answer you can give is you can say now the way in which frauds can occur have changed. The threat landscape has changed. The people have changed. The processes have changed. The technology softwares that you use have changed. So this brings about new vulnerabilities and threats. That's why we are recommending these new controls. So it's a little what you call not good in terms of expectation also when for example, when frauds take place in organizations in a department that we have carried out the internal audit, and when you do the fraud investigation, you realize, my God, there are these gaps also. If these gaps had been if we had recommended controls for these gaps, this fraud could have been prevented or detected. So that's
Yeah.
why I said that when you audit or review a process, you must try to get it right the first instance. I mean,
Yeah.
but the controls are not cast in stone. You always have the right to. It's humbling sometimes when you also, because you also can wait without recommending controls, knowing very well that the management might say, why didn't you tell this before? You reviewed it last year also, you're telling now our systems have not changed. So this problem would have been there at that time also. How come? So then the idea is, of course, to in any case be honest and act with integrity and suggest the control. So it's you have to manage it diplomatically. But as I said, you must try to get it right the first instance. I mean, we get caught many a time where when frauds do happen, we have not reviewed the process to the depth that we should. That's why, or we have not identified all the frauds that could take place. I mean, if you look at the collection and banking process, I mean, we might identify 3 fraud scenarios, but there might be 6, 7. So obviously, a fraud scenario number 4, 5, 6, 7, you have not really looked to see whether there are proper internal controls, only for fraud number 1, 2, and 3. So this you get with knowledge, as long as you follow the proper methodology when you review a process. Then if you spend some time thinking about whatever process, what can go wrong, what fraud risks are there, if you think, then ideally you would have put in place all the controls that should be there in the first instance.
Yeah.
Otherwise, as you mature, as you gain knowledge, experience, as you read upon these frauds, methodologies and all that, and fraud risk factors, then when your knowledge increases, then you realize, you can check this also, you can check that also. The thing is, you have to get skilled, educated and knowledgeable fast in this area, so that when you review, now obviously when you finish this sessions, you might now, when you do an audit, you might think of it in a different way. You might come out with new observations and recommendations. So that comes with knowledge,
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Then fraud awareness. So what do you mean if someone says, you must have proper awareness in your organizations about fraud? Then that means people in the organization have a proper understanding of the nature. How could what frauds could take place? How do those frauds take place? What causes those frauds? What are the characteristics of those frauds? Now, if I'm doing the cashiering role, if I know what the nature of frauds that can take place, what types of frauds can take place, how can it take place, why does it take place, how, why, when could it take place, what could cause it, and what are the characteristics of or red flags of these frauds? If I have that knowledge, right, that means, and if that knowledge is like known to others, if as the finance manager, the cashier knows that I know how he could steal, what are the red flags, what can cause those frauds, then you can ensure that everyone knows how frauds can take place. Everyone will be very vigilant. right? When frauds take place in organization, it happens because of a lack of knowledge about how frauds could take place, lack of knowledge on fraud risk indicators or red flags, excessive trust on people when you should not be trusting, lack of supervision of your subordinates' work, right? Lack of knowledge as to why people carry out fraud, how they are motivated, what sort of another reason why frauds take place is lack of internal controls. So there are a lot of reasons, causes: addiction to drugs, addiction, financial difficulties. So if you know what causes, what motivates staff to carry out fraud, how frauds can take place, what are the red flags of fraud, then you have a proper and you train your staff on those, right? We know that, if you have financial difficulty, you're going, I mean, you do that and bring it all out into the open, have participative self-assessment workshops, fraud risk assessments also carried out in a very, what you call participative open environment where everyone knows everything. Then you have, everyone is very vigilant. They know, we know that how they can steal. So fraud. So, and also if you say here periodic fraud risk assessments, if fraud risk assessments are done through a participative workshop, in a workshop kind of setting, then they also get trained. No? They get trained to identify frauds. They get trained in terms of evaluating fraud. They get trained in the importance of internal controls to prevent and detect fraud. They get trained in the importance of internal controls, in identifying the risks of fraud. And then fraud risk assessment would also enhance communication between the management and the employees on what sort of frauds could take place. So all this creates awareness. Right? So fraud risk assessment, that exercise itself will create a lot of awareness among staff that the management is serious about having internal controls to prevent fraud risks. Employee training about fraud, very important depending on the industry. If you're working in finance, if you're working in the banking sector, if you're working in plantations, the fraud landscape is different. Training on code of conduct values of the organization, mission, values, code of conduct, and also types of fraud that could take place if you have on a quarterly basis or half-yearly basis a session on, someone from outside comes to your organization and talks about the different types of frauds that could take place in your organization, that sort of thing. Then people also will start thinking about fraud. No? Fraud essentially is the falsification of transactions, yes, to some extent. Thus, an audit examination of transactions of fraud tests the existence of assertion. Right. So, that is, so when frauds take place, there are fraudulent transactions, false transactions, yes. Thus, an auditor's examination of transactions for fraud tests the existence. So, when an internal auditor or a fraud auditor looks at transactions and checks the source supporting documents related to those transactions, then whether the transaction actually occurred and exists, then you can find out whether the fraud has happened or not. So then there are some flow charts and the control. Objective: confirm purchases are properly authorized, and the controls that are there for that to ensure that purchases are properly authorized. So you can go through it at leisure. Computer fraud, there are about 2-3 pages. Segregation of duties. Minimize, if you want in the procurement function, minimize the possibility of frauds taking place in the procurement function. You have to segregate key duties among several staff members. So that no one person is responsible for creating a transaction, for checking a transaction, for authorizing a transaction, and disbursing money or whatever the transaction results in. So now the next area is the fraud investigation area, forensic auditing. So if you can just read that. So forensic auditing, when the word forensic is used, you must understand that most likely that auditing exercise will end up, the report that you prepare will end up in a civil or a criminal case, right? If you want to send someone to prison, you have to file a criminal case. But if you want to file for damages and you seek a restitution, if you lose 12 million and you want to get the 12 million back, you have to file a civil case. Criminal case will not give you that 12 million. It will only punish the offender. And if a fine is charged, that may have to be paid to the government. And if a penalty is imposed or if a sentence is given, he'll have to go, he will be jailed and imprisoned. So civil cases differ from criminal cases in many ways. But for this, for our syllabus, what we need to know is in a forensic audit, right? The audit is carried out to gather evidence that can be used in a court of law to prove that somebody carried out a fraud or to prove that somebody did not carry out a fraud. And it involves litigation support. Now, what we do as forensic auditors, we provide litigation support. We provide lawyers who will fight the case. We provide them with all the support that they need from the back, right? Or we may provide expert witness. Sometimes forensic auditors are called to provide expert witness. Yeah, we give an opinion. Sometimes in a case of medical negligence, if a doctor gives some drugs against to a child and the child dies and a case is filed against the doctor, then other doctors may come and give expert witness and say whether the medication given by that doctor against whom a case has been filed has given the right medicine or the wrong medicine. Or if a person is called upon to give his or her opinion on the counting treatment or on the use of digital forensic methodology, then you become an expert witness. You're a forensic auditor, but you are expert witness. But when we normally do issue forensic audit reports, we are not expert witnesses there. We don't play that role. We are what you call lay witnesses, lay, because what we do is we look at facts, we look at evidence, and we give factual findings in our reports and conclusions. We don't give opinions. But sometimes a forensic auditor may be called upon to give an opinion about some matter, right? So then you work as a witness, expert witness in those. So a forensic auditor will carry out fraud investigations and help support lawyers. That is, you provide litigation support. Or in some cases, you are an expert witness and you're called to court to stand in the witness box and give testimony. So in an investigation, they say why an investigation needs to be done. You know, if you are called upon to do an investigation, directors tell you to do an investigation for certain reasons, right? So if you are told to come and do a fraud investigation or a forensic audit, whatever you call it, what do they want to find out from that audit? Can you tell me? What do they want to find out? What do they want to find out from that audit?
The evidences.
Okay, what else? A forensic audit will result in a forensic audit report. A forensic audit is done by a forensic auditor because the directors of a company want to know certain things. They want to get certain knowledge about certain facts. They want to know about, so what are those things that they want to know? When they read your report, you need to meet those objectives. An investigation has certain goals or objectives that they must achieve. What are those goals? What are those objectives? Gimhani. What are the objectives of a forensic investigation or a fraud investigation? Can't hear you. Gimhani, Ganga, Gihan.
Quantification.
Right.
Any idea about the occurrence?
Any more? Anyone else?
A legal or technical aspect of the whatever that has happened, event or fraud.
Okay.
To identify the root causes.
Last student, can you just mention again what you said? Last person who spoke, it was not very clear.
Involved persons.
Right. So I think most of you said what I'm going to say now. Any fraud investigation is done. Number one is to see whether a fraud has occurred. Sometimes things happen in organizations, money is lost, inventory is lost, but they do not know whether it is a fraud or not. It becomes a fraud when it has been, when a person carries out an act or an omission intentionally to deceive someone and results in an organization losing something and the other person benefiting. So it's very difficult to sometimes prove whether a fraud has happened or not. So, but when you gather your evidence, you can sometimes prove that so and so intentionally has stolen something and it was done intentionally, and he has now passed some journal entries or destroyed certain documents to conceal, to create what you call a false misrepresentation of facts is there. And that was done intentionally by that person to mislead. For example, you steal some money and you cancel some receipts. But those receipt cancellations were done by that person to conceal the fraud, right? But it was so there is false misrepresentation of facts. When your collections are 100,000, 50,000 worth of receipts are cancelled by this person and 50,000 is stolen. So if you can prove that that person canceled the receipts, then you might be able to show that this person intentionally tried to misrepresent facts. The collections were purposely understated, right? He took action to conceal the fraud. So whether a fraud has occurred or not, sometimes investigations are done and you say, no, it doesn't look like there is a fraud here. It could be just negligence, not amounting to, I don't think the person has intentionally, he has passed a journal entry for 2.5 lakhs, but I don't think it was intentionally done to steal, or it has just happened through error. It's not a fraud. So that is very important. Second thing is, as you said, what is the fraud that happened? How did it happen? Money, cash was lost. How did the fraud take place? You need to know that. What was the modus operandi, the mode of operation of the fraud? You need to know that, so that you can explain, because sometimes the director don't know how the fraud has happened. So you have to tell them the money guy has stolen money, and to conceal this he has altered documents, and then he has cancelled receipts, and then he has gone and made past a few journal entries. How did it happen? The third thing is, for how long has it happened? 2 months, 3 months? How many transactions? Someone said about quantification. Any fraud investigation should come out with a figure, no? You can't go to courts and say something was lost. You say 5 million was lost, or you have to at least give a range as to how much was lost. So quantification of the loss, who was involved in the fraud? That is important, no? Any fraud, you have to tell so and so. Is it one person? Is it many people? Was there collusion? Who was involved? So what was the fraud type? Was there a fraud? who was involved in the fraud, how much was lost, how did the fraud take place, for how long did the fraud take place. And I can remember one of you also mentioned something about legal aspects. So the next thing that the directors want to know is, do we have sufficient evidence to successfully, in your opinion, prove that so and so carried out a fraud and to file a case? Sometimes when you do forensic audit, you end up telling the directors, fraud has happened, but I don't think you can pinpoint it to A. It looks as if everyone is involved. You can't say pinpoint and say one person took it. Controls are so weak. Journal entries are raised, but it has been raised by Peter, but in this organization, journal entry passwords are shared. So when it's shared, you can't pin the crime on someone. It can be anyone, right? So if the cashier's password is known to others while he's having lunch, he gives it to somebody else, then you can't say no. Even if a journal entry or a receipt cancellation has been done in the cashier's name, you can't say that the cashier is responsible, because the only thing he has to say is, I share my password. There is not only me, Gayan, Duminda and Prasang also know the password. Then you can't make him accountable. Then there are three suspects, because in a fraud investigation, sometimes all you have to do, the defense lawyer has to do, is to show that someone else also could be involved. Then your person can come out of it, maybe acquitted. Right? So evidence must be, they want to know, can you prove, do you have sufficient evidence? So those are some of the goals of an investigation, which you have to try and find out. You have to get the answers to those questions. So obviously, internal auditors can conduct fraud investigations, lawyers, and then other specialists, digital forensic experts and all that. Investigation and resolution activities must comply. So whenever you do a fraud investigation, you must look at the evidence ordinance, how you should get the data, whether you have authority to gather that data, legal authority to gather data or evidence, with the process, how you should gather the data, how you should evaluate it, how you should present it to court, data protection laws, labor laws, HR laws, all that you need to know. So you have to work closely with a lawyer who knows that side of it, because you can't breach a person's privacy or human rights or a labor law, or you can't go and ask for a person's phone, personal phone, even if you know there is evidence. You have to go through the proper channel, court order, and then proceed. So you have to be aware of the legal aspects. So management implements controls over the investigation. So when you're doing an investigation, how the investigation should be done, who should be the team leader, what are the processes that you should follow in an investigation, how you should preserve evidence, then how you should draft the report and communicate. So organizations also have to some extent a guideline that investigators should follow. You can't prepare a guideline or a specific procedure as to how you should carry out the investigation. That will depend on what audit procedures you need to do, will depend on the type of the investigation. So to that extent, you can't go. But what you can do is you can have policies and procedures saying at what point should an investigation be launched, how you should interview people, how you should collect evidence and preserve it, how you should draft the report, to whom you should communicate it to. If you are using investigators, what sort of qualifications should they possess? You can't get a marketing chap to do an investigation. You need, that person must be properly qualified, either from in-house or outsourced, right? And what are the rights of the employees? You can't just go and open their drawers and look at files, their personal stuff. They also have rights in an investigation. If you're interviewing them, sometimes they may have the right to have a representative from the union or from management with them. So you have to know what their rights are. It could be related to data. It could be related to privacy, data protection. It could be related to something stemming from a labor law. It could be related to disciplinary process. There could be terms and conditions in their contracts or trade union agreements as to how, what rights they possess, right? How you should terminate them, whether it's a permanent, temporary, or permanent termination. So you have to know all that. Disciplining of employees, how you should, for example, when you finish your investigation, then still you can't do anything. Then the disciplinary process starts. There will be a disciplinary hearing, and then the disciplinary code of the organization needs to be followed. And then at the end of that only, you will decide whether to promote, demote, terminate, file a legal case, how you should recover what was lost. So the general disciplinary procedure, the general process that should be followed in an investigation, the rights of individuals, qualifications, relevant laws that could be applicable, all that needs to be thought about and included in a fraud policy. The authority and responsibilities of those involved in the investigation should be clear. What is the role of the chief investigator? What is the role of the lawyer? What are the roles of others who are involved in the investigation in a very generic manner? You should have something. You can't be very prescriptive here. Internal communications about an ongoing investigation should be minimized. Yes, you can't publicize the fact. Everything has to be kept. The fact that confidentiality has to be maintained. Discussion must be exercised. Policy should specify the investigator's responsibility for determining whether a fraud has happened. Here, can you see? Now the chief investigator, based on the evidence that has been gathered, will say fraud has happened or not happened. So that responsibility lies with the chief investigator and whoever who has that responsibility. And management decides whether to notify outside authorities. Now, in a fraud policy, sometimes when there are allegations of fraud or when the exercise is over, whom you should keep informed. If there's an allegation, should you inform the CEO, CFO? Should you inform the insurance companies? If there's a claim involved, should you inform the police, nearest police station? Should you inform the CID? Should you inform the audit committee? All that will be in the fraud policy, so that everyone, should you inform the HR department, the legal counsel, all that will be included in the fraud policy, right? And it will also say the evidence that you collect, how to preserve, because when there is a fraud or there's allegation of fraud and you suspect fraud, you must preserve the computers and all that. Otherwise, if you allow a day or two to pass, all the evidence might be destroyed by the employee. It's very difficult to file a case in the absence of original documents and all that, right? Right. Then the responsibility of the internal audit activity. Yeah, so you all as internal auditors, or we as internal auditors, what is our responsibility? So can you just think about that? What should be our responsibility when it comes to fraud? Can you just think about it? So sometimes in an organization, when a fraud happens, companies, some banks and all that, they have investigation unit. So if there's an allegation of fraud, internal audit department will not be involved. It will be the investigation unit. Or if there is only an internal audit department, the investigation will be outsourced to a firm, right? So that is one part. Second part is sometimes internal auditors in their audit charter, there might be an item or scope, part of their scope may be to carry out investigations. So in that case, when you carry out, you might be primarily responsible for carrying out the investigation. You have a prime role, it says in your audit chart also. That sometimes you all do, mostly all do internal audits, but if there's an investigation, your department staff will be utilized to that investigation. So primary responsibilities with them. Sometimes when you do an internal audit, you gather evidence and you find that there is a fraud here, but you don't go to investigate it. But you have a lot of information. It may have been a cash count or a stock count. You have the working papers. You can act as a resource to whoever who's carrying out the investigation. You can support. You provide information, you provide documents. You may have done an internal audit in that area, and then you may have been the person to initially detect the fraud. So you can provide the evidence, but you can provide the resources, but the investigation is done by somebody else, in-house or outsourced. Or you can say you avoid involvement because it is responsible for assessing investigation, lacks resources. So you can sometimes say you don't have the resources or the skills, because internal auditor is ideally not the best suited and skilled and knowledgeable person to carry out fraud investigations, unless you have the necessary qualifications and experience to carry it out. Right now, what I've told you about fraud and what you will learn about fraud in the next 50 odd minutes is only about 5% of what you need to know. There's so many things. It's a full course, right? Forensic accounting, auditing is a full course. So you need to know all that. So now here you only touch on this subject. So with this, can you do a proper fraud investigation? If you have already done many, then that's good. Then you know, but you learn through carrying out fraud. You can't learn everything from the textbook. So internal auditors may be primarily responsible, act as a resource, or they avoid involvement because they don't have the resources. Any role is acceptable if its effect on independence is recognized and manageable. Sometimes, so what they are saying here is that internal auditors can carry out fraud investigations. There is no issue, but the only thing is you have to be competent, knowledgeable to do it. Second thing is sometimes when you carry out fraud investigations, as one of you said, that question that came right at the start. For example, now you have done an audit in the procurement department, and now 6 months down the line, a fraud occurs, and now you are told to do the investigation. So when you do the investigation, you also will feel that you were responsible for the fraud because you didn't, because there will be certain gaps in the processes. Now, had you told them before when you did the audit, this fraud wouldn't have occurred. So there is a self-review threat, self-review, where you are reviewing something which where you were earlier on you recommended something, but now you're reviewing this, so you will be a little reluctant to confess or to accept or to state that there are internal control weaknesses. If you say this fraud happened because of these weakness, then they'll turn around and ask you, why didn't you tell us 6 months ago? You would have plugged those holes early on. So there is an independence issue, no? So you have to use a different team. So that's why they say sometimes independence may be impaired if an auditor has done the audit also and now called upon to do the investigation in the same area. So we must identify what the independent issue is and then manage it appropriately. Sometimes independent issues can be if they have worked in that department, now in the audit department, and now the investigation goes back to such an extent where in that period you were there in that department. So independence issues, but you can manage it. Changing the people, or if the department itself you feel is fully not independent, then you can get an outside party to do it, right? Internal auditors typically not only assess investigation, but also advise management about the process, including control improvement. So another objective that I actually forgot to tell you, the goal of an investigation is to recommend improvements to prevent a recurrence of the fraud. They ask you, what were the weaknesses and what can we do to prevent this fraud from taking place again? So you offer control improvements. So to be proficient, fraud investigation teams. Now look at this. If you as an internal auditor want to be proficient in carrying out fraud investigations, you should have knowledge about the fraud schemes. Sometimes when we do audits, since we do not have proper knowledge or we do not think to the depth required about the fraud schemes that could take place in the area that we are auditing, we don't ensure that all the controls that should be there to prevent the various types of frauds are there. But if we know how to identify the fraud schemes, if we read up on this, right, then we will ensure that there are controls to tackle all those fraud schemes. So you need to be knowledgeable about how frauds can take place in that area that you're auditing. Investigation methods. When you do a fraud investigation, it's not the internal audit approach. The methodology is different. You have to know about how to collect evidence, how to present evidence, how to evaluate evidence. You need to know about the various laws, rights of people, the legal framework, as one of you said, how to investigate. Is it digital forensics? Is it documentation review? Is it forensic accounting? Is it interrogation of people, right? You need to interrogate people and get personal statements. So you don't know all that. So your investigation methods are a little different. And the applicable law. If you follow forensic audit class, you will learn about the laws, the anti-money laundering laws, the evidence ordinance, all that. Internal audit activity may use in-house software or outsource it. So sometimes what we find is, in certain cases, companies outsource it. So investigation plan. Can you just go through this? We will have a 2-minute break.